Good evening. Welcome to the new school. My name is Fabio Parasecoli, and I'm the coordinator of the Food Studies program here. It's a program that started a few years ago. It's growing pretty fast. So starting from next fall, we have a full-on major, a minor, and we're working on new projects, including a minor in food design. And in our school in Paris, we're starting to work on a food design master's program that should launch in 2016. So we have lots of things going on. We're very happy about that, but we continue doing what we've been doing for quite a few years now. So all sorts of courses on food history, culture, policy, politics, environment. And the interesting thing is that most of our courses are open to the general public. It's part of the tradition of the new school, and we're very happy to continue that. And in that same philosophy, we organize many events. This is part of a series. This is actually the 5th one in this series, Dining and Design, that we started last year with the James Beard Foundation. And thank you to Mitchell for one of the engines of these events. Also, if you're interested, we have an open online course online called Innovators of American Cuisine. We developed it with the Julia Child Foundation. We're thinking about one on food design, but we'll see how that works. For the moment, that's there if you're interested in the culinary arts. And last but not least, we have a website called The Inquisitive Eater on inquisitiveeater.com, and we accept submissions from anybody in all sorts of fields. So we would be very happy to have designers, architects submitting material about their thought about food or experiences. So that said, I'm very happy to have this panel today here, and I think I'll just let Mitchell Davis do the introductions. Mitchell Davis is the Vice President for Communication, right, at the James Beard Foundation.
Not really, but...
Sorry?
Vice President, period.
Oh, Vice President, period. Okay.
Yeah. Vice President of periods. It's a small set of communication. Punctuation, yeah, we're very particular.
And as I said, he was behind this idea of the Dining plus Design series. He will talk more about that, and he will introduce tonight's guests.
Thank you, Fabio. Actually, it is Jim Bieber and his colleague who was on our Design Awards Committee, Peter Guzzi, who created this program. And one of the reasons was that we give out awards at the James Beard Awards, which happened just, oh my God, was it just last week? For restaurant design, and some people, a room full of chefs or even a room full of food journalists, wondered what a food organization was doing giving out awards for architecture and interior design. We used to also do a graphic design award, but that's another conversation. And it was Jim and Peter who thought we needed to further not just sort of the appreciation of particular designs, but actually the relationship between dining and design and the impact that one has on the other, because increasingly, certainly in New York City, they go hand in hand. I say in New York City because not in every place. You know, I'm a fan of people who believe that they really want an authentic Italian trattoria, and most authentic Italian trattorias really are brightly lit, fluorescent bulb restaurants with TV screens over the refrigerator where the ingredients are kept, and actually no one really wants one of those here in New York, although they say that, and Fabio can speak better to that as a genuine Italian. So not everywhere do the two are the two so integrally linked, I think, but in New York City, certainly when we're talking about restaurants that reach the attention of the media, when we reach the attention of the James Beard Foundation, let's say, dining is a fundamental part of that equation and often overlooked. We think of service, we think of food. Some people now think of sourcing and sort of a notion of sustainability, a farm-to-table movement, but even then I think we sometimes forget the design. And so we are having this conversation today with a bunch of designers, the Bentel and Bentel group, who I'm flanked by here, Paul, Peter, and Carol, who have been designing many things, but some of the most iconic restaurants in New York City for many years, and restaurants as different, I would say, as Gramercy Tavern on the one hand. This is a reel of some of their projects. and the modern on the other, two places that couldn't look any less alike, let's say, but certainly two places that have some things in common that we'll talk about, including a unique relationship to their place, let's say. Marco Canora, who is the chef of Hearth and a partner in the wine bar, it's hard to call it a chain, but the Terroir wine bars. And Katie Grieco, who is a managing partner of the Colicchio restaurants, so some that these folks have designed, obviously. Oh, and I should say, of course, that Hearth was designed by these, that's why Marco is here. And Colicchio and Sons, I mean, you'll see them all running through here. Craft, obviously the original Gramercy Tavern. This is a casual conversation. We're going to talk amongst ourselves a little bit for you and the audience at home. Everything is being filmed and will be available online in a few days, as Fabio said. And then we'll open it up to questions, because really we're just here to engage in this conversation, the relationship between food and the environment in which it is served and the design of that environment. And I'm just going to start with you, Peter, and say, what is that relation? Why does it matter? What is the difference between eating at home alone in a black box without any light on and eating in a beautifully designed restaurant?
Good question. I think the issue is not just how dining or design responds to the character of the food that's being served and the manner in which it's being served, but how dining and design work together so that there is a seamlessness to that. Sometimes it doesn't always have to be fancy. Eating a Sabret's hot dog outside from a cart is as much of an experience as eating at Le Bernardin. And so what we end up contributing to the mix of food, service, and design, the design aspect, is trying to find that sweet spot where the food and the service are as well served by design as design serves the food and service itself. You know, that we are looking for that red thread that links those other two elements that are so important.
And are you looking for a balance there between those things? Is there an equilibrium, or does it really depend on the project?
I think it really depends on the project. I mean, certainly that is always a goal, to get an equilibrium. But sometimes, you know, in the instance of the design for 11 Madison Park, that was a space that was historically landmarked, the interior. And Danny Meyer, opened that restaurant. Now Will Gadara and Daniel Hum run it and own it. That was a space that was in search of a restaurant. There was a lot of discussion at the beginning of what kind of restaurant would fit best here. And so because we were given a kind of mise en scène, because we had so much historic architecture that we had to keep. But it was an interesting kind of reversal of the roles, and it certainly shined a light on the role that design plays in affecting how food and service are thought about. In other cases where, like Gramercy Tavern, one of our first projects, first full-blown restaurant project, there we were really seeking out a character, really trying to design something that would be, that would fit what, in that case, Danny and Tom Colicchio had in mind for the notion of a contemporary tavern, which involved a lot of research and so forth. Then we tried to bring that idea into that space, which was clearly not a sort of, the Parson Capon House near Hartford, Connecticut. It was a building built in the late 1800s in a certain, the Flatiron District of New York. We couldn't impose the idea of some sort of, as Danny would say, sort of yieldy tavern onto the neighborhood. We wanted to become a part of the neighborhood. And so we needed to find the spirit of what that character meant architecturally, while he and Tom were looking for the spirit of what that meant from a service standpoint and from a food standpoint.
I just referencing Gramercy Tavern. I think it's very interesting there as an example of the way in which design influences the way in which the restaurant evolves, because we've had the opportunity to work in Midtown and in the Ladies Mile District and downtown, and the character of the relationship of the space to the street, for example, has a tremendous impact on the whole demeanor of the interior. The Midtown restaurants that tend to be sort of driven by a business community are very different service concepts, and I think it's largely the architecture that informs the way in which you experience the space. So that's not to say that things can't be changed through careful treatment, but it's just a reflection. Gramercy really has a very different kind of character than Le Bernardin. And in fact, when we were working on Le Bernardin, one of the goals was to try to bring some of the spirit of Gramercy, that, you know, the windows on the street, for example, the community on the sidewalk, to a restaurant that had historically been relatively closed, because they understood there was another generation of diners that they had to start to cater to.
Yeah,
Please.
I just wanted to add, just to comment on the equilibrium question, because we also noted how different some of our work is. And I think it's different because every chef is different, every restaurateur is different, the location is different. It's like doing a painting and someone handing you a number of colors from each one of those sources. And then we're also different designers than other architects who are out there. And I think that's like, you know, mixing, it's a new recipe each time.
So I'd like to get to the process a little bit later. I want to ask Marco, you're a chef restaurateur, and with your training and your experience, you have a vision, I imagine, of the food and the menu and the sort of restaurant you want to have. When does the design come into that? When did the design come into that? And are you looking for someone to articulate what you want to do, or to contribute to that conversation in your own head?
Well, you know, you look around of late and you look at like the big buzzy restaurants, and it's funny, you know, Mission Cantina and Mission Chinese, and I guess the original Momofuku Noodle Bar, you know, this notion of like, these guys, it was all about the food, you know, and as a chef, I love that notion of it being all about the food. And I think it's really a tricky thing to figure out, you know, when is it right to make design, to put so much effort and thought and money into design. And it really depends on the kind of, what eyeballs are you looking at this project through, right? If, you know, I know when I did my first restaurant, Hearth, 11 years ago, you know, like everything in this city, the space drives the conversation, and finding that real estate deal, it's all about finding that real estate deal. And there's very few people in this industry who kind of have the resources and the luxury to really search and find the space first, right? Like Keith McNally is famous for that. Like, he goes around and he gets his sights on a space, and everything is born from the space. And, you know, for me, it's like, it depends on who you are and where you're coming from and what kind of resources you have that drive this conversation. And it's really nice to know that a Bowen can come to town and find this dilapidated shithole of a place and do nothing to it, right? And throw, literally like Dwayne Reed color bulbs are the extent of the lighting, and it's like national acclaim, like that. So it's really interesting. It really is interesting because, you know, in this conversation of food and design and food, and it's like, you know, I love the notion of under-promise, over-deliver. And when you get a guy like Peter Bentel, who's going to blow it up and do an unbelievably stunning space like Craft, and we opened up Craft, I mean, that room to me is like one of the most beautiful, most timeless rooms ever. And it's still, to this day, you walk in it and you're still kind of like, oh my God, like I feel like I just walked in it for the first time. It moves you, that space. But I tell you, like, it's really, you have to, the food now has to live up to the space.
Right.
And it does. And it does. Oh, no, listen.
Of course it does.
It totally does. I mean, I was, you know, I created the food, and we all created the food at the beginning. Katie and I opened up Craft. But I guess my point is, it's like different strokes for different folks, and everything, it depends on whose eyes you're looking at it through.
Yes, sure.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, I think Craft is a good example of, you know, the design of Craft was born out of the food concept 100% in that case.
Yep.
You know, Tom had a vision for what he wanted that restaurant to be and how the food would be served, and it was, you know, about, I mean, you can speak to this too, but it was about taking a single ingredient, the best possible asparagus or sea bass or ribeye, and preparing it as simply as possible, just so that the essence of that ingredient was all that you tasted when you took that bite. And so it was going to be presented family style, and each ingredient was served separately.
The tables were huge.
Right, so it informed the design, not just from you know, we needed big tables to accommodate that, but the idea of craft really then became everything about how the Bentels thought about designing it. It was about how the tables, making sure that, you know, the tables were made of natural materials, because it was all about, you know, again, essential ingredients, but showing how the tables were put together, so they weren't glued together or hammered together in a way that you would never see. You know, they were very expensive and handcrafted by an amazing mill worker who you can see every joint and everything. And so, you know, in that case, it was all about the design coming from the food concept. But I think there are times, I mean, to your point, there are even times where, you know, we see real estate and we think, we got to put something there, right? And, you know, and so in some cases, you find real estate and you think it's a good deal or it's a great location, and you have to sort of back a concept into it in some way.
I'm hearing a theme that I hadn't anticipated, which is the difference between a project led by a restaurateur and a difference between a project led by a chef. And obviously many chefs cross over, but even later, the third and fourth restaurant are driven by different things than that first. I'm going to cook, I've waited for this moment, and we're going to present my thing. One of the first interviews I ever did in the food world was Paul Bocuse, terrifyingly, in his hotel room, and I had to do it in French. And I asked him what the most important remnant that we could have, this was back in 1991 actually, of the Nouvelle Cuisine was, and he said, you know, expecting him to say, I don't know, sauce on the bottom, no butter, whatever, all this sorts of reduction, something. And he said that the chef's name went on the door. That was the biggest change in food, that we haven't really gone back or haven't retracted from. And so the notion that you have something to say and want to find a way to help express that, even if you don't know how to design the space that says it, it's a different thing.
You know, you look at Keith McNally restaurants, they're not chef-driven restaurants, right? And it's like you wonder, I know I wonder, because there, you know, I have more restaurants in me, and it's like, you know, where do you want to go with it, right? Do you want to do the Keith McNally thing and find the space and find the architect and design this super duper place that the food can be it only needs to be as good as it needs to be, which is saying not that great, and people just want to be in that goddamn room like Balthazar, like,
which is true. You just want to be there.
People just want to be there, right? It's not because it's the best steak frites ever. I mean, it's really secondary, right? And as a young restaurateur moving forward, you know, I'm constantly batting around this notion, right? Because chef-driven restaurants that aren't about creating a beautiful environment kind of require a lot more investment of time and people and talent, right? Whereas a Balthazar, it's like, man, you build that thing and you have that lighting set, and it's like it kind of does it by itself. And it's a big initial investment. It's a huge initial investment. But it kind of lasts forever. And same with craft. Craft, the design. It's not going away.
I just want to pick up on one thing that you're saying, though, because I don't think it's appropriate to give the impression that restaurants that have a lower public ambition to be great design have a lower standard of design. I mean, the spaces that work because of the way the tables are set up, the way the lighting is prepared, and that can happen in an environment that doesn't have that layer of finish for the fancy tables.
Well, like Roberta's, for instance.
I was just going to say Roberta's, right.
I think that it's also really important to understand that when there is collaboration between whomever it may be that's designing the restaurant, it may actually be the wife of the chef, who knows, or the husband of the chef, or an architect or an interior designer, when there's a collaboration or a common spirit between the food and the way in which the character of the space, and also something Peter mentioned, the service concept, because I think the triad is very important. How you deliver hospitality ultimately in a restaurant has to do with all three of those things.
Right.
When there is collaboration, when there is a common vision, the product is always authentic. It feels good. It satisfies in the way that you're talking, deeply satisfying,
Sure.
rather than being something that you think after you're done with it, you know, I spent a lot of money, but what did I actually get out of this?
Right.
So I think we should not take away from this the idea that you either design a restaurant or you don't design a
Right.
restaurant.
Right.
Even a Roberta's has an element of design, even though they didn't spend a lot of money.
And it's-
There's a functionality of design
Well,
too.
it's-
Absolutely.
Right, so.
And it feels authentic to what that place is.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And
It
authenticity.
smells a little authentic,
Yeah.
So let's talk about the process a little bit, because I'm a chef. I want to make a restaurant. I'll start from the chef perspective. I come to you folks. How do you know how do you figure out what, I mean, as food people in particular, we often have difficulty articulating things outside food, but I think design is one of those things that's very difficult for people to articulate anyway. I mean, even, how do you figure that out? How do you figure out what I mean?
How much do you want to spend a square foot?
Okay, that's an easy conversation.
Not to bring it down,
Yeah.
but to Marco's point, matching expectations is a very important part of the design process. And if someone comes to you and says, you know, I really don't have a lot of money to spend, I mean, we will actually counsel them that perhaps, you know,
Go somewhere else.
you should, well, we'll try to accommodate it, but maybe this is not the way to do it. And make sure you find a space with a great lease, for example. In order to be successful, the restaurant has to be wonderfully conceived, beautifully executed, and profitable at the end of the day. So I think a large part of what we start out by doing is just trying to understand what the appetite is for the finish. Then, of course, the question is, well, what's the concept? Typically, it's, you know, a menu or a set of words, metaphors that sort of carry the day.
I would say that.
Do you need to eat my food?
We definitely
It would be good.
need to eat your food, but I think
Maybe
we
it'd
would
be
ask you a lot of questions. I mean, we would be trying to draw out some of your ideas. You say you can't articulate them. You will be saying some words, and we'll be taking those words and turning those into something that's a little bit more concrete. When we did the Bernardin, Eric came up with 7 words. Then the list kept getting longer, but we kept those words up on a whiteboard throughout the whole project. And we kept returning to those words to see if we were meeting his expectations for the restaurant.
You know,
I can add one thing about the process, that one of the things we do, especially with people who have not had an architect or an interior designer involved in the design of their restaurant, and I mean a restaurateur or a chef, there is frequently a misconception that they say the 7 words, or we have a conversation, then we go away, and about 20 minutes later we come back with complete renderings of everything. Here's your restaurant, that's it. It is, for us at least, a massively iterative process.
Okay.
And the team, that is us, the restaurateur, the Katie and the Marco, we all sit together, we go through planning strategies first to try to work on the sort of flow of the restaurant. And only later on in the process do we actually get to the imagery, to what it is. It's percolating in our heads, but we are not rushing to what I imagine happens in the kind of more Balthazarian world of let's get the image set and then we'll figure everything else out after that.
You know, my favorite process, I've done quite a few restaurants, is the materials board. Like, I think that is really the nugget for me that really starts speaking to the space, and you start talking about what materials you want to use. And at Craft, because it was so kind of elemental and it was like bare bones essential, like everything was like kind of copper and wood and leather, and to create a material board, bronze, right, with those elemental materials, I think is a really, it's a good starting point, I think, in design.
I mean, I think that, sorry, I was going to say that, I mean, he's not kidding when he says it's a massively iterative process.
Right.
And the number of sort of back and forths of, do you like this table layout? Do you like that table layout? 4 tops, deuces. And I think, design is not only sort of what this place ends up looking like, but it's how it functions.
Yeah.
And I think, I feel like I personally spend a lot of time on those kinds of thought processes, because that's how you provide great hospitality, is that you're not having waiters sort of bumping into tables on their way in and out of the kitchen, or people sitting right next to the service bar and, having the butt of the waiter is
Right.
waiting for the drink at the service bar right there. So those kinds of sort of operational efficiencies or halfways
Right.
through the restaurant or whatever.
So over time, have you developed a sense at any project of what you need for that to work? I mean,
I don't
I know
have,
you went
like,
to
I don't
hotel
have-
school, and I did
I
too,
don't-
and
I-
they give you ratios and whatever.
I'm not, I
Right.
don't,
Work that
I've
way.
forgotten a lot of that. I'm embarrassed to say.
Yeah.
But I think that, one of the nice things about working, I've worked really exclusively with Peter as
Yeah.
far as this group is concerned, as much as I would love to work with Carol and Paul. But one of the nice things about sort of working time and again with the same designers is that you sort of speak the same language, and he knows what we like and what we don't like, and so it makes the process sort of go more quickly, and maybe there are fewer iterations. I don't have specific formulas of like, it needs to be this many deuces and this many, because it really depends sort of location to look. What you need in Las Vegas is a little bit different than what you need in New York City, and you have to take those kind of things into account.
Explain just a little bit why. What would be the difference? Between Las Vegas and New York City? What do you
Well,
need in Vegas that you don't need in New York City?
400 seats.
Yeah, you
There's
need more
400
seats in Las Vegas. We serve a lot of large parties in Las Vegas.
Right.
You also, in a hotel environment, have to address, single dining in a way that you don't really address it so much in a place like New York City. Yes, we have some single diners who, so those kinds of things.
More expensive private dining, I think, in
Oh,
Vegas.
sure.
But there's a
So things can
culture,
stay there.
there's a culture of dining in New York, which is very distinctive.
Articulate that a little.
Well,
for
the
me,
table
please.
settings tend to be a little tighter. Tables are slightly smaller. We might go to 34-inch. There's a sense that that there's an energy in the community of diners that is really acceptable. That people elsewhere in the country are a little scared of. When you talk about New York style.
Sirio Macchione, who just won our Lifetime Achievement Award, was famous 30 years ago. He said, when people asked why his tables were so close together at the original Le Cirque, he said, if Sophia Loren is sitting next to you, do you want to be 6 inches away from her or 1 inch away from her? I don't think I get that everywhere.
Elsewhere, space is what the commodity.
Right.
Here, it's proximity
Right.
is the commodity. And I think that you really run a challenge in Las Vegas, for example. Space also comes at less of a premium than it does
Yeah.
here. It costs a lot of money to have a large restaurant in New York City, so you're going to fill it up with as many tables as possible. So a lot of things driving that. But
Right.
also the audience, the degree to which the audience is sort of aware and capable of dealing with that is.
There's some other aspects about space. I know in some cases we'll actually shorten the distance between the two patrons at the table because we want them to be intimate. Or we'll do something like raise the floor behind a bar because we want the bartender to be looking at the patron and not be towering over them. So it comes from the chef, the bartender, the restaurateur, some of that guidance. But we then tweak everything we do in order to accommodate that. And then I just wanted to address the material boards because I think you should have this in an architect's office one time. Because if you came to our office, we have tables in our office for
That's
each
awesome.
project. And we have a basement that just full of metal in one section, granites in another, all of the materials.
fabrics,
And
yeah.
when
That's awesome.
we start a new job, you have some ideas and you'll go down into our dungeon and you'll start sort of pulling materials.
It's a mine.
And so, and you'll start pulling things that go together. Now, for example, if Katie called up, we'd know maybe to use bronze.
Yeah.
And start out with that material. Then you
Not
pull
if she
other
can help
things that go with it. But it's like this. I wouldn't call it a toy store. It's just it's like all the materials are there, and it's a wonderful way to kind of pull things together. So when we do the material boards, our clients see just a little piece of that, but they see it in unison with all the other pieces.
So one of the things I think people think about when they think about the architecture of a restaurant is the physical building of it, and that doesn't happen that much in New York because the spaces are largely existing, and so that leaves the interior design of it, which has its own connotations. What's the difference between an architect and interior designer thinking about those materials on that board going down into the mine? Because
Well, our office is made up of mostly architects, rural architects, but we have interior designers as well. And we all work together. And sometimes an architect in the office will do the millwork, which is building something mostly out of wood, but not always out of wood. But then sometimes the interior designer will do it, and we do switch on some of those items. I don't know. I think our work is not just surface treated because we're architects, and our interior designers are not decorators. They're thinking spatially, and I think there is a difference between architects and interior designers, but I just want to.
I mean, I think Carol can actually speak to this very well because she's, among other things, an expert in Italian modern architecture. But Italian modern architects had an expression that they should be able to design everything from the spoon to the city. And we feel that that's very true in our office. The people who succeed most in our office, including the partners, are the ones who can design everything from the spoon to the city and understand the relationships they're in. And so for us, there isn't a real distinction between architecture and interior design, except we know that neither of those two are decoration full stop. The idea that we might go to a flea market and put a bunch of stuff all over the place, which is actually sort of a thing that's happening, it seems to us, in the world of restaurant design. But we would not do that. We would try to look for a more spatial, sort of response to the program elements and so forth.
There's also, there's a very big infrastructure, mechanical, electrical, plumbing infrastructure in restaurants these days, and I think that is what triggers the involvement of the architect. But I think there should be a shout out to the interior designers that we have in our office, because they do really engage the details of making things. I mean, one thinks of an interior designer as someone who's placing objects that have been prefabricated broadly, but that's not the case at all. It's really much more heavily involved in actually putting things together in a very technical, physical way.
So I mean, we do the whole shoot and match, from knowing what's behind that ceiling and behind the walls, all the way down to designing the furniture, and probably the spoon.
The opportunity.
If we pay
very
you.
frankly, right of you. Didn't tell you, put me where I'm supposed to sit, right?
Yeah.
So what are the challenges, and from an architectural project standpoint, we've alluded to some of them, but the restaurant is a unique experience in some ways. What are the opportunities it provides for you? And we'll talk to you guys later. And what are the challenges or the frustrations, just from working in restaurants, period, forget if they're in New York or...
You mean as a building type?
Yeah, as a project type, right?
Well, before really doing a lot of hospitality work, we did libraries and religious buildings. Pretty much, that's what we were doing, and some large houses. And now we don't do any churches now that
Well, it's either or with restaurants or churches, I think.
Worship at the altar.
But, I mean, there are some similarities between those building types and the mostly interiors that we're doing, because you still have to greet the patron. You still have to make sure people are comfortable and seated at the right kind of chair and table for whatever they're doing. You still have to do the math, no matter what. And buildings take a long time to do. We have a gymnasium going up for St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn right now, so we're still doing buildings. Restaurants happen a lot faster, and it's rewarding from that standpoint, because you have an idea, you're working with this group, and then suddenly it's there, and they're serving food, and you're still painting. The contractor's still painting. And so they happen much faster, and you can see that creative work blossom really fast and be living much faster than a building. So that's one difference.
From your perspective, is there something that you haven't been able to do, or that you imagine in a restaurant that you would like to have done, that either they said, no way, that's not happening, or that one day you hope to have the opportunity or the money or the right things to...
Well, listen, it's like he said earlier, like how much do you want to spend per square foot, right? It's like...
So what do we have to spend per square foot?
Well, it runs the gamut, my God.
Well,
it's like... It's like this,
$300 to
To
$1,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is for construction, FF&E.
Right.
Okay.
for the whole thing. But through my experiences, like I've always, you know, my ultimate fantasy before I die, I hope, is to be able to build something that without a budget, right? To find some big sugar daddy who's like willing to just dump $6 million into like 1,000
Wait till
square
this goes
foot.
out on
6
YouTube.
million?
Whatever, I don't care. Whatever the number
Doesn't that often
is.
lead, 25?
It's always
Doesn't that often lead to
everything.
the worst restaurants?
Listen, you
Can, absolutely
You
can.
always find things you want that you can't have. And
Right.
even if you're building a $6 million craft or a $12 million Lafayette, I bet, like, there's always these materials that you want that you can't have.
Right.
And it's like, it's this exercise in saying, is it gonna be this or is it gonna be that? Like, do you want that to be a
Compromise,
window? Or do you wanna get those chairs? Or do you want that? So, and it's like, that's what this game of building
Right.
restaurants is. It's
Right.
like, where do you wanna spend the money?
Right.
Because you could just spend, I mean, it's like so fun to
Right.
spend money on materials. It's the best thing
Right.
ever. And these guys always have access, and they show you the coolest shit that you want so bad, right?
Familiar with that.
Yeah, and it's like, and it's funny because, well, it's funny because even at, you know, at $1 million restaurant on a budget, or a $9 million restaurant where you think it's a lot, not, you know, where you have a big budget, it's like the same stuff happens at every level.
Yeah, for me, honestly, I'd rather, to me, and maybe the Bentels don't want to hear this, I would love to design restaurants that really are like not designed. Like, I mean,
Right.
and, you know, to the extent that Roberta's is not designed, if we can say that, like,
Right.
there's something really cool to me about the idea of,
Well, yeah, the
Just-
ROI, the return on
Right.
investment. I mean, you know, the other,
But there's something,
listen,
there's
the other,
that.
I
well,
think there's
listen,
something else though. People want, I bring people to Roberta's for radio show and like restaurateurs who have beautiful restaurants, like, oh my God, I want one of these.
Yeah.
And I keep asking them what it is they think they want from that.
Well,
You could probably make one.
you know, one
well,
thing.
that's exactly, I mean, I hadn't been there, honestly. I mean, I'm a late adopter to many trends in this business, but I had not been there until about a month and a half ago, and I went with my husband and my youngest son, who I was sure we were going to be made to wait for like 3 hours based on what I'd heard. But we were trying to find a restaurant that served pizza because my kid wanted pizza and something else because I didn't want pizza. So we went out there, and I was sure that I was going to be one of those people who was like, what is all the hype,
Poo-pooed it,
right? And I did. It totally worked for me, and they accommodated my son, and we sat at the bar, and there was a TV, there was a basketball game on, so he was like perfectly occupied.
It's about the package.
But it was the complete
Right.
set of characteristics for our dining experience
Even
at that very
ugly
moment in
block
time.
is part of the
Right,
experience.
and it just,
Yep.
it worked then. I wouldn't bring everybody I know there, but it, you know, for the right,
But if you had
The pieces
arrived,
work
arrived
together.
at Balthazar there, you would have thought that was a horrible theme restaurant, and what were they doing? And
Correct.
In some way, I mean.
Didn't fit the neighborhood.
Right.
right.
You know, that's, Peter mentioned something else which I think is very important. You asked what opportunities exist within the context of restaurants in urban environments are really urban institutions, or they can be. And when the restaurateur and the chef and the designers and the whole team are aspiring to respond to that potential, then you've got something that's really terrific. And I think that's why restaurants, on the other side, things that are frustrating, the restaurants that are just, you know, they put up a storefront window and it's a Potemkin village and there's nothing really, it doesn't really have the content and substance of it. So you have a potential as a designer to really influence the way people experience urban life. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
You know, what I find fascinating too about all of this concept of like, you know, design and food and restaurants and how they relate, you know, restaurants are like human beings. They evolve and they grow and they morph and they change. And you can't really say that about the design. I mean, the design becomes patinaed, and I think like, you know, Lafayette, for instance, is going to be much cooler in 35 years than it is now because it wants to look like it's 35 years old. And the kind of expertise of the Keith McNally Balthazar is he was able
Started
to...
100 years old.
Yeah, with this
Right.
30-year
Opened
patina
100
on
years
it.
old.
Smoke stained before they
Yeah,
opened.
smoke stained before they open the door. And, you know, every restaurant buddy I know and all of the restaurants I've been affiliated with, it's kind of fascinating to think about how, you know, concepts and restaurants evolve, but design doesn't. And I don't know, just as
you
a,
agree with
as a,
that?
as a concept.
I'm not sure that
You
I
don't
agree with
agree?
that, but-
Tell me how the design of a craft will dissolve. Like, you have that leather wall, you've got that blue painting, you've got the lights, you've got the wood. It's like that doesn't go, it doesn't, the copper. I mean, that place looks today, bronze, sorry, material guy.
I think
Explain to me how it does.
I don't think the space necessarily changes in terms of what you see, but your experience of it changes in profound ways. Because when Craft opened, it had a relationship to other restaurants. It had a relationship to a food environment, restaurant culture at a time. That has changed, and I think our perception of what that space is now different. I also think most restaurateurs, and we celebrate this, will tweak restaurants. 11 Madison Park is a great example of a space
Completely
that has
different
been
Completely different.
transitioned
Same
in
space.
very subtle ways to completely change the perception of it. It was supposed to be a big brasserie, and it's evolved into something
Let's
very
face it,
special.
BERNARDIN, we were directly involved in the transformation of that space to bring it up to a kind
But
of...
even-
That was a remodel, though. I
But
mean, you
even to
guys
your-
dumped a lot of money and time and closed it and turned it into something. It didn't morph.
I think
That
the
was
classic
something
thing
you
of the
did
Four
to
Seasons.
it. You did to it.
I think the morphing had been taking place
Wow.
steadily
Let's go
over
at it.
time, and there was a certain frustration about the way in which the space was not accommodating that, to
Wasn't
your
working
point.
anymore.
But I do think it's something that had been gradually changing over time, so that it built up. And the interesting thing there was that there were certain aspects of the prior space that were deemed to be iconic, and as a consequence, those are the things that we maintain. So yes, design and construction is a bigger investment of materials and time and energy than the menu is, for example. You can go out and buy, roast beef one day and fish the next.
Right.
You can't do that with the bricks and mortar, but that does not mean that bricks and mortar don't have the potential to be transformed in ways over time. Perhaps a slightly...
Certainly in perception,
Look at the
anyway.
Four Seasons restaurant, I think, is a perfect example of something that, because of the food and design and restaurant environment over its 55 years, has changed what that restaurant signifies completely.
Yeah.
And nothing's changed inside, really.
Right,
They can't change it.
And it
Right?
had a changeable concept anyway because of the seasons, so it in itself didn't appear, the idea that the trees change.
Right. But from the design standpoint, it went from being cutting edge to being classic. In the middle was the most dated place. When you talk to the owners, the
Right.
most dated restaurant in the city at one point.
And now,
Right.
I don't know if it's landmarked, but it's
Yeah,
now got
it is landmarked.
significant preservation issues.
So yeah, it's not the physicality of the space doesn't change, but the perceptions and the era around it changes.
And the meaning
And
changes,
if we've
right.
done our job right, from our point of view, also, the spaces age with grace, and
Like craft.
Craft, Hearth, like the bones are there, and it kind of gets older and a little bit more worn in. I will not forget when the black stained white oak bar top for Gramercy Tavern was installed. Frankly, Danny and Tom were kind of like, this is too new, and they're like, just give it 6 months, you'll be fine. And sure enough, over time, it just gets more and more dented and dinged, and it kind of wears in. And that's part of the growing in process that transforms even their relationship to their own space, because they get to see it change in front of their eyes.
I think that's part of what, when I think of Bentel and Bentel as designers, that's part of what I think is sort of part of what you guys do. Not every designer builds restaurants to be timeless, right? And some are very trendy looking, some, use materials that don't age well, but I feel like, everything I've seen you do, certainly the things you've done for us, are places that, based on the fact that you're using sort of natural materials and you're, whatever, it's...
They don't look dated in
I hope not.
10 years.
Right.
Can I
And they wear well.
Add
One-
something
yeah.
to that some of our background in doing religious buildings and libraries
Right,
really
helps.
related to that, because we were doing institutions that were, you do them once, and they would be there for many years before any government or religious group would give money to it
Okay,
again, and we
right.
wanted them to be there forever. And so that's sort of the attitude that we've taken
Yeah,
in our design work.
those were project types where the clients
Like
were in a
David
deferred
Rothbard,
maintenance program.
Right, right.
30 years.
Yeah.
So
Timeless
I
ain't
think-
cheap, though.
right.
Timeless ain't
Right,
cheap.
I think-
I had a conversation with Peter when we opened in Sieme, and I was like, I want this place to feel, the same, and it's like, I wanted this big, thick I was like, I want this really big, thick bar top.
You know,
And you were like, yeah, of travertine.
Yeah.
And you were like, yeah, you could have it.
Oh, that's what I was
Sure,
like.
it's like, that piece of stone will cost
That was a case where the architect
$165,000.
was talking the client back off the rent. He's like, you can't have that.
Right.
I mean, I'm happy to sell it to you.
Yeah, it's a great timeless idea.
No, but usually it's the other way around, where someone's coming to you with a synthetic product saying, no, we've got to use this, like when, I'm going to say like a trade name, but Corian came out. So we priced a whole kitchen in granite, and we priced it all in Corian. The granite costs the same, so why wouldn't we get the granite?
Right.
You know, I mean, and it's timeless, and if you nick it, it still looks like granite. So, and
Well, that's
it's-
your style, to your point. That would be your decision. I think aging gracefully is a good place to stop the conversation, and since we're all doing it by the minute, and maybe let's put it out to the audience for some questions.
I just have to leave. I'm a history teacher, but I want to tell all of you how you make my life. I love what I do. And you, from food to architecture to a restaurant, you make my life really jazzed up. I cannot thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean that. I'm jealous. I wish I were an architect or a chef after a teacher. I still love what I do. I thank you for, I love my city, and you make it all the better. So thank
Thank
you.
you.
I should
Yes.
say that we're all teachers too, so we love what you do.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you. Other questions? Now we have some students from City Tech in the audience. That's seniors, you must have questions as seniors? No, what do I do next is your big question. Fabio?
I was listening to the difference, you know, in some places the space, it's precious, here is proximity. What does it mean in terms of imagining the restaurant as a place of spectacle, you know, as performance? And how you adapt that to the necessity of the flow that you were mentioning? You know, you don't want to bump into restaurants, so you have to make a spectacle, but it has to be a functional spectacle. How do you work those aspects together?
Should I
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like a lot of times when we've worked on designing restaurants, there's talk about sort of activating the space, right? And so if, you know, you just don't want a sea of tables from one room, you know, from one end of the room to the other that you need, we like to see anyway, and I guess maybe certain restaurants that are more formal would say that this isn't the case, but, you know, we think that part of the whole experience is to sort of, in a nice way, exhibit the work that's going on by the people who are there, whether it's, you know, somebody opening a bottle of wine, or in cases where we have an open kitchen, you know, being able to show you know, you have this at Hearth, but being able to show the chefs and cooks at work. And I think that, so finding ways within a plan that sort of makes sense and is well thought out to allow, you know, visual activity and the spectacle. I mean, in this, especially in an era where like chefs are superstars and, you know, foodies are taking pictures of every plate in front of them, you know, the spectacle is often right at their table, or, you know, the bartender making the drink and lighting a drink on fire or whatever. So it's really, it's all happening in plain sight. And
I think the spectacle does need to sort of embrace the main idea that's going on in the restaurant. So it's not spectacle for spectacle's sake, but that what you're looking at brings out some of the ideas in the restaurant. I'm thinking of Rouge Tomate, which we did, which was it was supposed to be about juice and fresh drinks, and so we created a juice box. And it sort of sounds like what little kids drink out of every time I say that, so it's not sort of funny, but we wanted to make sure that the people making the juice in the juice box were looking out at the people at the bar, and the bar was actually embracing the box. So it was very much that the architecture took on the concept that they wanted to have in the restaurant, that they couldn't physically say, make a bar that wraps around the juice box. It just evolved into that. And so when you walk in there, the spirit of their concept, we hope, comes forward. And it's spectacle, but it's not contrived.
Right.
It just kind of happens.
Well, and you can't leave out all the New Yorkers and tourists and people who will be in a restaurant. That movie Dinner Rush, that reminds me that when you see the restaurant go from sort of in the course of a day, from an empty space where everyone's getting ready to work to this alive performance. And then Peter's off to all the other things that happen at the other end.
Yeah, I was just going to say that part of the spectacle, I mean, you know, why go out to eat? You know, because you can't cook the food, hopefully, that the chef is preparing, because they do it better and they have access to better ingredients. Someone else does the dishes at the end of the meal, you don't have to. And in between that time, you get to dine in public and be with other people. So for us, part of the spectacle is the dining in public part. We want to make sure that the dining experience is really a solid one that can accommodate you for the hour or two that you're going to be there, and that you can partake of this experience, this kind of communal experience, with a small group of your own table, but then a larger group of the dining room in which you're located or eating. And then the next time you go to the restaurant, because hopefully there'll be a next time, you can have a different experience, but still be dining in public. And that, to us, that's a, you know, you spend most of your time in a restaurant as a patron at your table for a few hours. That's really important for us, that experience of the diner in the seat with their group looking out at the rest of them.
We worry about what people see when they're sitting there. Like, we won't put a seat where you're facing a wall, because you can't see behind unless we put something reflective there. And we worry about what the people look like at the table, because you want your mate to look good, and you want to look good too. And we really worry about...
You stand at the door and tell people they can't.
No. We worry about how the lighting hits them.
You're going to wear that?
No.
Yes, that is
Very frequently, right.
No, we worry about how the lighting hits them and the colors around them, because it really can change your perception.
And everyone notices a restaurant that makes people look good. You hear that. I hear after noise, everyone's too noisy, and some place has beautiful lighting, and we're going to go there. It doesn't matter what they serve.
And that is definitely another key element of it that is so overlooked, is the acoustics of it. I mean, it sounds technical, but you cannot have a great experience for the hour or two that you're there if you can't share in the experience with the 3 people you're sitting with.
Yep. Other questions?
So when this wasn't shown, which is not the whole time out there, so you would say that every restaurant you design is completely different because the person is different, or sometimes it's the same person but the restaurant ends up being different. But actually, if you look at your show, there is something about the restaurants that's the same. And so I would ask you the question, so what is it that makes how do you know when you're in a Bentel and Bentel restaurant? And you know, what if you got blindfolded and taken to a restaurant and you would know, and what is that? And I would ask, you know, Marco and Katie the same thing, like where's your identity in these spaces? Because it is there, and I'm just curious what you think.
Well, if it's Korean, we know they didn't touch it. Forget it. Right.
But that's a good start. I mean, the materiality is one thing. I definitely think that you know, we are so interested in using materials as a touchstone, as a common language to build around. I mean, certainly in the design of craft, bronze was one of the first materials that we
what do you call the copper?
But anyway, so materiality is very important to us. Frequently, though not always, we discovered in doing massive amounts of research before we designed Gramercy Tavern, because we had not designed a full-on restaurant. So we were given a list of, you know, 16 restaurants all around Italy by Danny Meyer, that some of which Tom had gone to as well. And we traveled around and visited all those restaurants. And we noticed in most of them being built in ancient Italian buildings, the rooms in which the restaurant, the dining room was located, was the size of the length of a chestnut beam, which is about 21 feet, which gave rise to 3 tables across, 4s or 6s at the sides, 4s or deuces at the sides with 4s or 6s in the middle. And that anchored everyone in the room. It made everyone feel great. The deuces or 4s at the perimeter felt like they could sort of watch the show, the spectacle of the 6s all laughing uproariously at someone's lame joke or whatever. You know, that sort of experience really provided a kind of architecture for how to organize the public dining rooms in restaurants we've designed. And in many, again, not all, because the spaces don't really accommodate that, always, but in many of these spaces, that kind of organization strategy is employed.
I want to talk about the materials. I think we have a consistency of materials within each restaurant. Like at the Modern, there's a lot of glass, right? At BERNARDIN, there's wood and there's metal, just two things. And we talk a lot about painting with a broad brush. Why add yet another material here? Why not look at our palette, keep it simple and elegant? And I think that a lot of times you go into a restaurant, every wall is treated like something different, and that's not the way we think.
And then there's a layer of decorative elements that have the potential to overpower the qualities of the existing space. So the material palette is also something that's very tactile. I mean, in other words, I think they're very conscious of what people see and feel and are able to touch. And so when we talk about materiality, we're talking about materials that age well, that are naturally patinating, and that deliver a kind of textural quality to the space that frequently you don't find in interiors.
One more thing, I think our ceilings are different than everyone's, because when you go into a restaurant, you really don't see the plan. When you go into any room, you don't see the plan. There's furniture on the plan, there are people on the plan. But often, it's the ceiling that you can see, and we spend so much time on the ceilings. We try to hide the sprinklers and the HVAC. We don't really use light fixtures very much. That's one thing you'll find.
That's decorative.
Yeah, they're hidden, and we use light. We don't use the light fixture. And that is something that I think almost all of the restaurants follow.
Except Craft.
I was going to say
Except-
something.
the light bulbs at Craft, right?
But
That had a purpose.
Yeah, that had a total and complete purpose. That was, we were searching for, because everything had to speak to this idea of something beautifully, a great primary ingredient that was handled with the kind of care that a craftsman, not an artist, would bring to it. And so we were looking for some evocation of what is light. And it seemed like bare filament bulbs were the right thing. Now they're everywhere, and it like, why did
Your fault.
It started there.
Right. No, Alva had it first, but that had 4 bulbs in the front, and it wasn't like we knew about it because we just weren't. It was like you needed something that would evoke.
The right answer.
Yeah.
Decorative fixtures also date the space. And again, because we were always going for this, we want this place to last forever, and this timeless idea that light will do that, but a fixture, you could probably figure out what year it was.
I also feel like there's something about your designs, there's always been some sort of, not always, but I think in a lot of the cases that I can think of, a very sort of large-scale art piece.
Yes.
Yes.
Right? You know, whether it's
That's
River
absolutely
Park or Gramercy or, you know, they all seem to have something that really is like a statement.
Anchor, yeah.
Whether it's a visual anchor like at Craft, that you're sort of looking down staring at that big Stephen Hannock, or at the Modern is obviously, you know, I just...
Really
Those windows at River Park.
It's a big deal because for us, again, we try not to decorate spaces that we design. We try to design the space, and when there is a decorative element, like a painting, for example, or a piece of artwork, we try to think of it as though it were a piece of architecture, and it plays that role.
Yes.
It's an interior window,
Absolutely.
for example.
In all of those cases, I feel like.
And so at any rate, I think that it's very sensitive to pick that up.
Good. One more question, sure.
No microphone
yeah.
required.
The question's for Marco. As a chef who has like changed restaurants, like from working in different restaurants, do you think you have to change the food to mold the dining room, or does the dining room mold to your cuisine?
You know, what I do as a chef in terms of this type of food that I do, it's like I'm defined, so I'm not going to turn into, you know, the of the moment Korean, you know, Asian spicy food. So, you know, I think it's not so much about the exact type of food, it's my approach to food. So I always like, I'm a less is more kind of guy, and my food is very simple and it's not cluttered with stuff. And any restaurant that I'll ever design in my future life will have that same aesthetic. The less is more aesthetic, kind of rip down the walls and let the space show me what it has to start. And I think that it's a reflection of my approach to food more than the actual food itself.
Okay. I guess you're allowed, it's your school.
Thank you. I was thinking about designing from the spoon to the city. I really like that. How does it work? What's the connection?
Say it in Italian. Dal cucchiaio alla città.
Dal cucchiaio alla città. Right. So how do you design the spoons and the dishes? I mean, as architects, probably that's not part of your job, but as a chef, you might have very clear ideas of what the dishes and the spoons and the silverware works. You might have to meet somewhere, right, in terms of decoration, but also practicality, and what's your idea about the food you're making. How does that work? How does that interaction happen?
One very interesting point, it is not uncommon for us to meet a client and ask them what they want the restaurant to look like, and we're shown a place setting.
Well, yeah, the table, I was going to say the tabletop is a huge, the tabletop, oh, it's a huge starting point.
You know, and there really needs to be a consistency of a kind of, not to be too highfalutin, but a kind of ethical and spiritual continuity from the tabletop to the design of the place. And if it doesn't exist, it's something that has to be invented, which is one of the ways that restaurants and hospitality concepts change over time. Those two things have to come somehow into sync.
Right. And like Peter said, most of you're sitting at a table. Your experience at a restaurant.
For the guest.
Yeah.
That's what you see.
And it's huge.
Well, tabletop affects how many seats you're going to have. It affects what your general revenue stream is going to be, the kind of food. It's absolutely critical.
But in your process, right, in designing the space, how much do you take that into consideration, or do you ever?
Tables, when we,
The
during
tables
the job,
or
we
what?
No,
actually-
the top, the stuff on the table.
We actually
The
go
way it
through
looks.
With many of the restaurateurs or the chef generally, to the place where we're buying the plates. And we will cut out either plywood or cardboard tops, the exact size of the tables we're putting in, ovals included, and we'll bring them into the shop, set them up, put a tablecloth on them, and put the plates out.
But I
So
know that,
that's first, like is the chicken there, the egg, so that's first, and then the rest?
It can be very early on in the process. Very early on in the
but
process.
at the Modern, I think, I remember hearing that you guys helped like choose the flatware and all
Oh,
of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
It was such a design-heavy
It was
kind of
such a
project.
design-heavy
Right.
The
I mean-
hooks in the back.
But
Right.
we'll frequently have arguments about whether or not the seat is 1 inch too high or too low, for example. Because if you sit on a 19-inch high seat or an 18-inch high seat or a 16-inch high seat, you communicate an entirely different attitude towards the table, for example. 16-inch high seat is a little loungy, the seat has to be deep. I mean, those are things that are absolutely critical to the way we set up the space.
And we talk about what you're eating or drinking when you're sitting on that seat. And we do mock-ups. We do mock-ups for everything. All the banquettes are mocked up once and then modified. And chairs that are even out in the standard chairs, we will go to the chair company and ask if we can cut it in half and push it together and make it smaller.
I think we're much closer to the $1,000 a square foot thing. I'm just feeling that.
You have a table at Craft, or did have a table at Craft, that was completely custom designed. I mean, that thing was like the dashboard of a Mercedes in order to accommodate the table sizes, the material finishes. That was at BERNARDIN, the booths, the banquette in the bar is 1 inch lower than the banquette in the dining room. Primarily because we knew that diners were not going to have to wear jackets in the bar.
And it was a question of sitting up or lounging, and we made sure that the tables are also 1 inch different.
But to get back to what I think you were also asking, how do we negotiate, so to speak, the kind of the look, the appearance of the spoon or whatever. Frequently we get involved in that. Someone like Katie or Marco will say, "Oh, this is what we're thinking," and it's never with these two wrong. It's always the right kind of thing, and it's very personal to them. We don't want our restaurants to look like sweater sets, from the 50s. We want like when we say, Katie pointed out big pieces of art, we'll say to the artist, it's this big by that big, here's the material palette, do something. We don't prescribe. And in the same way, for this kind of more intimate scale of stuff on the table, we don't necessarily always need to feel like we have to prescribe what that is.
Yeah, it's just we're reacting to.
So, I mean, Does this not happen? I feel like this happens to me, that sometime a chef or someone with a very sophisticated gastronomic sensibility doesn't always have a very sophisticated design or architectural sensibility. That must happen sometime.
It does.
Oh, I can imagine.
It does.
Yeah.
It definitely does. And what we get is, the classic, it's usually, titans, captains of industry, titans of the financial world. They think they know how to do one thing, so they think they know how to do everything.
Yes, right.
And, you get that sometimes. It's not even an egotistical kind of thing. It's just a misunderstanding of just how in-depth one has to go or could go in order to understand what's the right choice. Right? So there's an education process.
One of the funny things, one of these conversations was with Dan Barber and Peter, as his designer, and Dan actually said, it's a good thing no one listened to him, because every single thing that became iconic of his restaurants, he fought against. Every single one. So,
he's an honest man.
Okay, well, this is a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you for watching, if you're watching us online. And that concludes our season of Dining and Design, but hopefully we'll be back next year, the new school.
So, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.